Hello, sixth graders. This video is about percent problems. And as we'll see in a moment, there are three types of percent problems. But what I want to begin with is to make you realize that any of these percent problems involve a relationship among three numbers. And the relationship is a very simple one based on multiplication. This is a problem that I hope that all of you are very comfortable with, that you could have done easily in fifth grade. 3/4 of 32 is, of course, 24. There are different approaches to this problem. If you were to do it the long multiplication of fractions way, 3/4 times 32 over 1, and of course we multiply across the top and bottom and we get 96/4. 96 divided by 4 is 24. But I would never do the problem that way, and I don't think you should either. If the numbers were different, you might have to. But the easy way to do this one is to realize what 1/4 of 32 is. 1/4 of 32 is, of course, 8. 3/4 of 32 must be 3 times bigger than that, 3 times bigger than 8, and I've indicated that down here. 3 times 1/4 is the 3/4, and of 32, or times 32. And recall, of course, we link the word of with multiplication. When you have the word of between two numbers, it indicates a multiplication. Well, multiplication is associative. We don't have to do the 3 times 1/4 first. We can do the 1/4 of 32 first, which is 8, and then do 3 times 8 to get the 24. And finally, 3/4 as a decimal terminates. So we can take the decimal equivalent of 3/4, which is, of course, 0.75, 75 hundredths, and do a decimal multiplication. 0.75 times 32. It's kind of small here, but you know how to do this. 0.75 times 32. You just pretend you're doing 75 times 32, which would give you 2400. And then, of course, you've got 2 digits to the right of the decimal point, so you need 2 digits to the right of the decimal point in the product. Place the decimal point here, get 24.00 or 24. So a very simple problem, but we're going to make this the basis of our understanding of percent problems. Anytime you're dealing with a percent, the definition is crucial. X percent is X over 100. Or you could go the other way. If you have X over 100, it's X percent. Now notice there are no restrictions here. The X could be literally any number. Positive, negative, zero, fraction, integer, any number whatsoever. There's no restriction because there's no possibility of a zero in the denominator. The denominator is 100. If we're adding or multiplying fractions, if you're trying to do A over B times C over D, those denominators cannot be zero. That's a restriction. But here we have no restriction. X percent is X over 100 for any number X. Well, here's the same three numbers. And notice I've put the word type here in quotation marks. That's a word that I've used for the past several years. It's not necessarily in the textbooks. But I'd like you to think of the percent problems as being of three types. But here's the key. It's really the same relationship. There are three numbers involved in 75% of 32. Now, you know what 75% of 32 is because we just did it. The 3/4 of 32. 3/4, of course, is another name for 75%. If you take the 75% and write it as 75 over 100, which it is, that fraction reduces to 3/4. So we know what this question mark here is. It's 24. So let me replace that question mark with a 24. And if you want to know how to do the type 1 problem, I did it on the other board a few different ways. All it is a multiplication. You take 75%, no matter how you want to represent it. 75 over 100, 0.75, 3/4, whatever representation of 75% works for you. multiply it by 32 to get 24. That's type 1. Type 1 is the easiest because it's just a multiplication. It does not involve any algebra. Now, this is sort of a spoiler situation. All three of these problems involve the same three numbers, but the different types have one of the three numbers unknown. In type 1, it was the 24 that's unknown. In type 2, it's the 32, right? We know that this question mark is a 32. 75% of 32 is 24. And in type number 3, it's the percent that's unknown. We can read this as what percent of 32 is 24. And we know that the answer is 75%. We've already explored how to do number 1. Let's look at how to do type 2 and type 3. We'll pretend we don't know the answer and take a look at them. I've rewritten the type 2 problem in a slightly different way. On the previous board, I showed 75% of question mark equals 24. But this says the same thing with the WN standing for what number. And this is typically how a problem like this would be presented to you. 75% of what number is 24. Now think about how we handle in math, how we handle an unknown number. What do? We pick a letter to represent it, right? So let me rewrite this question, which is the type 2 question. Let me rewrite it this way. 75% x equals 24. With the understanding, of course, that 75% x is a multiplication. 75% of x is 24, equals 24. All we've done is replace the what number with an x. The of is multiplication, and we put an equal sign for the is. This is an algebra question, but we already know the answer. We know that x is 32, but pretend we don't know it. What would we do? Well, it's important to always remember 75% is not the whole number 75. Go back to the definition. It's 75 over 100. You have a couple of different options here, but this is not one of them. This is not correct. The equation is not 75x equals 24 because 75% is not the whole number 75. So that's out. But what are our other options? Well, the most direct option is 75 hundredths times x equals 24. We could do that. Now, I'd probably reduce the fraction at this point to make it easier. But let's go ahead and not do that. Let's work this problem out by just leaving the 75 over 100. This is a one-step algebra equation. A number times x is 24. How do we isolate the x? Well, we divide each side by 75 hundredths. Divide each side by 75 hundredths. These 75 hundredths will cancel, leaving the x by itself. And if this looks mysterious to you, algebraically, it's no different than this. 3x equals 24. If we had 3x equals 24, we would divide each side by 3 to get x equals 24 divided by 3, or 8. This is the same thing, except with the fraction 75 hundredths. So we've isolated the x, and we know that it is 24 divided by 75 hundredths. We know how to divide by a fraction. Multiply by its reciprocal. So this becomes 24 over 1 times 100 over 75. To divide by 75 hundredths, multiply by 175ths. Multiplying across the top and bottom, we get 24 over 2400 over 75. And I'll let you finish that. If you do 2400 divided by 75, you're going to get 32. We knew that x was 32. Now, I'm trying to make this a comprehensive video where I'm showing you all different approaches. Why is that? Because everyone's different. Some people are going to be comfortable with one method as opposed to another. But I'm always going to try to emphasize understanding what's going on in this problem. In this type 2 problem, we're trying to find the number that you can multiply 75% by to get 24. And that number is 32. Let's look at a different approach to the same problem. I wrote off to the side here what our result was the previous way that we did this problem. X was 2400 divided by 75, which was the 32. I leave that there for a reason. Watch this. Let's say you're comfortable with decimal numbers. Let's say that you like to represent the 75% as 0.75. And of course, 75% means 75 hundredths. This decimal number says 75 hundredths. Algebraically, this is the same as the other problem. We have to divide each side by 0.75 to isolate the x. Divide by 0.75. I love this aspect of math where we do a problem one way, we do it a second way, and we realize they're really the same way. Watch. Cancel these 2.75s. And now we are back to something that we covered extensively back in the fall of 2019. Decimal operations. This is a decimal division. 24 divided by 0.75. That's what the x is. And how did we learn to do decimal divisions like this? Well, we learned that if you're not a calculator, it's difficult to do the long division 24 divided by 0.75. So we multiply the top and bottom by 100 in order to get a whole number in the denominator, which makes the long division easier. 0.75 times 100 is 75, and 24 times 100 is 2400. You see what I mean? If you do this problem with 0.75 rather than 75 over 100, you get the exact same result, 2400 over 75, which is 32. One last way for this problem, and then we'll move on to type 3. Well, as we said before, 75%, of course, we know that that's 3/4. So let's write the problem as 3/4 times x equals 24. But here's the one common theme in all of these methods for solving this type 2 problem. We have a number times x equals 24. Divide each side by this number to isolate the x. So divide each side by 3/4. The 3/4 on the left side cancel, leaving the x by itself, which is what we want. So the x equals 24 divided by 3/4. How do you divide 24 by 3/4? Multiply 24 by 4/3. So that the x is going to be 24 over 1 times 4/3. Now, we could cancel here. We could cancel the 3 with the 24 and get 8 times 4, which is 32. That's the answer, of course. If we just do this the long way, we would get 96 over 3, which is 32. 24 divided by 3/4 resulted in 32, which we knew to be the answer. So that's it for type 2. Type 2 is a one-step algebra equation where you're trying to isolate that x, and you have a choice. Use the form of the 75% that you're most comfortable with. Here's how you're likely to see the type 3 problem worded. What percent of 32 is 24? Now think about that grammatically. Make sure you understand how the question is working grammatically. What percent of the 32 is the 24? Well, the 24 is 75% of the 32. This is the same problem. It's the same three numbers. So the answer to the question here is 75%. That's the percent that 24 is of the 32. Well, we have to make this a little bit more algebraic. And let me start with this. You have some idea already that if you're looking for a missing number, you name it with an X. But the problem here is this won't quite work unless you make an adjustment at the end. The what percent here, the unknown number, if you just write it as X, what is the number you multiply 32 by to get 24? Well, that would be 3/4. Let's just put it that way. But you were asked for the percent that 24 is of 32. It's not 3/4%. It is true that 24 is 3/4 of 32, but that 3/4 is not 3/4%. It's, of course, 75%. So here's what you should do rather than just writing an X here. Write it as X over 100. Now, before you go on with type 3, make sure you understand that this is correct. What percent, the X here will be the percent when it's over 100. What percent of 32 is 24? This X is 75, which is the correct answer to the question. Okay? I'm sorry that it's a little bit of a subtle point here, the idea that you've got to put the X over 100. And now we've got a little bit more of an issue. This type 3 problem is a little bit harder. That's why it's type 3 than even the type 2 problem. What I usually suggest to people at this point is we have an equation with a 100 in the denominator. We don't like that. Nobody likes fractions. If you can avoid fractions, you should. Well, how about if we multiply each side by 100? Why am I doing that? Simply for ease. Simply to make the denominator go away so that the problem is easier. When you're working with math, try to take charge of the problem. Of course, you can only do things that are mathematically correct, but we can always multiply each side of an equation by the same number. These hundreds will cancel, leaving us with X times 32 equals 2400. Let me write that as we normally do. 32x equals 2400. Okay? Dividing each side by 32, we get that x is 2400 divided by 32. And I'm not going to do the long division. You can if you'd like to confirm this, but I guarantee you that 2400 divided by 32 will give you 75, which is the answer we were looking for. Just one last point about this problem. If you had proceeded with x times 32 equals 24, I wrote this down earlier and suggested it's not quite right, but if you had written it that way, you would have gotten x equals 3/4. Divide each side by 32, or you would have gotten x equals 0.75. If you would then multiply that answer by 100, you'd have the percent. 3/4 of 100, 3/4 times 100. Dividing each side here by 32, x would be 24 over 32, which is 3/4. If you then multiply by the 100, that you could make the adjustment that way to get the percent, which is exactly what I did here when I multiplied both sides by 100. That was the adjustment so that the answer would come out to be a percent. This is quite a bit for 6th grade, but it's within your grasp. Do the best you can always, and I'll see you soon.